So the US presidential election's first presidential debate has just taken place between incumbent President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump. It was really a wide-ranging debate, ranging from issues of domestic politics, but also foreign policy. We'll be talking about some of the foreign policy issues here, lots of debate about the war in Ukraine, as well as what's happening in Israel and Gaza, as well as NATO and Europe. So joining me now is Derek Grossman, who is a Senior Defense Analyst at the RAND Corporation. Derek, thank you for joining us. Could you tell us a little bit about what the major foreign policy issues were that the two candidates were debating during this first debate?
Well, thanks for having me. Yeah, so foreign policy came up as a subject of the debate pretty early on, within the first maybe 30 to 40 minutes, but it only lasted maybe about 10 or so minutes, and it focused mainly on the war, Russia's war in Ukraine, as well as Israel's fight against Hamas in Gaza. And so the two candidates went back and forth on those issues. And the issue that is near and dear to my heart, of course, is the Indo-Pacific. And it was, I think, a little bit surprising that the Indo-Pacific wasn't really covered at all in the
Right.
debate. China was mentioned early on in the context of Trump's trade tariffs against China,
Mm-hmm.
but that was mostly, again, from the perspective of a domestic audience, right? And the impact on prices within the United States, rather than part of a larger debate about how China should figure into U.S. foreign policy,
Mm-hmm.
as well as our wider policy and strategy in the region.
Right. Could I ask you a question about, let's just go thing by thing. Of course, we first had, I think, very quickly there was a question about Afghanistan. President Trump, of course, attacked President Joe Biden for the withdrawal from Afghanistan in September 2021. Do you think this is an issue that continues to have political relevance, continues to sort of haunt the foreign policy record of President Joe Biden? You travel Asia a lot. Do you think that this is a conversation that comes up a lot about sort of the American withdrawal from Afghanistan?
Yeah, frankly, in my discussions with interlocutors throughout the Indo-Pacific, they bring up Afghanistan and our very messy withdrawal from that country very sparingly. It's
Mm-hmm.
not really an issue at the top of their minds. But as you mentioned during the debate, former President Trump brought it up to hammer, our current president, Joe Biden, on how it demonstrated that he was incompetent in terms of carrying out U.S. foreign policy objectives. And Trump actually attributed our withdrawal from Afghanistan as being a key reason why Russian President Vladimir Putin decided to invade Ukraine a few short months later. Now, I've seen no direct causation there. And I think it's not an accurate claim as far as I'm concerned, but the kind of impression, the perception, if you will, of the American people that that is in fact the case, could factor into our elections coming up in November.
Right. And, a lot of conversation then about Russia and Ukraine as well in the Ukraine war. There's, of course, been a lot of questions about Donald Trump's relationship with Russia. How do you think he handled those questions about, this idea that he's soft on Russia in some senses, that he would not have stood up very strongly for Ukraine had he been in office when the Russian invasion of Ukraine was launched? How do you think the two candidates handled questions on Russia and Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, so Biden asked Trump point blank, "Are you planning to withdraw from NATO?" And there was no response from Trump.
Mm.
So that was, I think that's pretty unnerving for those of us who value NATO and our longstanding alliance and membership in that organization. Trump also said that he would resolve the Russia-Ukraine conflict once he's president-elect. So not even when he's president yet, right? So some of these claims, I think are things that we have to think about and be skeptical of. But at the same time, I think Trump's argument that the U.S. could do more or maybe do less, right? Kind of handle the situation differently, and maybe that would elicit a different reaction from Moscow. Is something worth considering, although we are pretty far down the path of supporting NATO and also supporting the Ukrainian resistance with large scale aid packages. And so it's kind of hard to see how we would dial that back, especially in a short period of time, the way Trump would want us to. And he may get the chance to, of course, if he wins the election.
Right. And again, you were mentioning that people, of course, who value NATO might feel a little unnerved, as you to use your word, about the conversation, that debate. I think that old debate again about President Trump saying that, look, NATO countries aren't paying enough for their own security. It seems like the Americans seem to be underwriting the security of Europe. How do you think, though that debate has evolved over the last couple of years, do you think that since President Trump, he says that I've made NATO pay hundreds of billions of dollars, sorry, billions of dollars more. President Biden hasn't been able to deliver that. That was his accusation, at least. How do you see the facts on this particular question about making European countries pay more?
Yeah, so I don't know the numbers on that per se because I don't focus on Europe,
Mm,
but I will say that there is a long-standing debate in US foreign policy. And
mm,
when I say long-standing, I mean, really since almost the inception of our country, really the inception of our country, which pits those who, want to be more isolationist, more retrenchist on one side of the debate, and
mm,
then on the other side, those who think we should play more of an active role in global affairs. And I think what you have seen since the end of World War II has been a much more activist U.S. foreign policy. It started out with
mm,
countering communism worldwide, but then after the fall of the Soviet Union, uh, and the U.S. became the sole remaining superpower in the global system, you saw a continuation of U.S. activism throughout the entire world on lots of different issues, right? Trump from 2017 to early part of 2021 really represents kind of an attempted departure from that position to be more focused on the U.S. and what is needed here domestically rather than focusing on lots of things going on around the world. And I think if we get a Trump 2.0, you're going to see that particular strand of American foreign policy be very invigorated or reinvigorated,
mm,
right? And so that could spell, the end of our membership in NATO, our withdrawal from international organizations, possibly to include the United
mm.
Nations, as wild as that may sound, because Trump is a true believer, I think, in having a more isolationist posture in the global system.
Right. So is it fair to say that if you were Vladimir Putin seeing this debate right now, you'd be fairly happy with the result, judging by how President Biden has performed and how President Trump seems to have performed?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you're Putin right now, you're clearly rooting for former President Trump to win again because you think that it's going to be easier. It's either A, going to be easier to cut a deal on Ukraine and get most of what you want there, or B, maybe President Trump will decide that supporting the Ukrainian resistance is not in U.S. interests, that we need that money would be better spent back at home, and therefore it would be an easy victory for Russia, and they wouldn't have to negotiate at all. And so yes, I think what we saw in the run up to the 2016 election between former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and Trump, our own intelligence community assessed in early 2017 that the Russians had tried to actively interfere in our election on behalf of Trump and against Clinton, right? So that gives you, I think, a good sense of how Putin is feeling about the election coming up.
Right. Could I ask you to move, slightly closer to the Indo-Pacific, but of course not. We're not directly at the Indo-Pacific just yet. On the Middle East and what's been happening there with Israel and Palestine. There's, of course, President Biden comes out and says during the debate that he saved Israel, and of course there's a peace deal or ceasefire deal on the table, and of course you then have President Trump coming in and saying that this would never have happened if I was in office. Can you talk to us a little bit about because this seems to have really acquired both a lot of domestic salience as well as foreign policy salience. This war in Gaza. Can you tell us a little bit about how the two candidates handled questions on the wars in the Middle East?
Yeah, I mean, I think Biden has a plan to try to achieve a ceasefire and hopefully a permanent end to hostilities between Israel and Hamas. I think Trump's position on it, it's actually kind of interesting. It's changed a little bit. I think early on his position was support Israel no matter what, and this is basically Israel's global war on terror, and we need to be there and not criticize Israel. But I think within the last maybe 3 months or so, we've seen a little bit of a change in Trump's thinking. He thinks that Israel's not carrying the war out effectively,
Hmm.
and it's actually possibly harming Israel more than it's helping. And so we've seen a little bit of criticism from Trump. He gave an interview, I believe, with the Israel Times, in which he criticized Netanyahu, which was pretty surprising because Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, is a close friend of President Trump's. And when Trump was in office, he supported him no matter what. And then, when he was asked at the debate tonight about, a potential for a two-state solution, Trump left the door open for that and said, "Well, it kind of depends what it looks like."
Right.
So his position has changed somewhat. I think it's become more centrist, and Biden's position, I think, has also been quite centrist on these issues. And
Hmm.
so I think the candidates are actually closer on that issue than maybe it might have seemed just a few months ago.
Right. I can ask you how you think this debate will be seen by leaders in the Indo-Pacific, by leaders around the world. Lots of questions about that. How this debate, how does this debate reflect on the willingness of America to remain engaged and remain sort of a leading, engaged global power? How do you think people around the world will see this debate?
Yeah, well, I think you can't have a conversation in the Indo-Pacific or around the world for that matter without talking about this election, right? The consequences are so incredibly important, right, for U.S. foreign policy and really, and therefore for the world. And it's neck and neck. The race is neck and neck, so it's too close to call. But if Biden were to win re-election, you're going to see a continuation of his policies, which is really stressing the importance of alliances and partnerships throughout the world to maintain a rules-based international order. If Trump wins, you're going to, it really depends who he surrounds himself with, right? Because in the first administration, most of the people he surrounded himself with were actually folks from previous administrations who had the same sort of activist thinking in on global affairs. But a Trump 2.0, I don't know that he would hire those same people,
Mm.
and he may hire more people who think like him, which is more in the isolationist, part of the spectrum. And so you might actually see again a withdrawal from NATO, international organizations, maybe a downplaying of the importance of U.S. alliances and partnerships, and that is something that's at the top of the mind of our friends and our rivals alike, right? So
Mm.
it could be huge changes ahead if that were to happen.
Right. And do you think the anxiety about those changes will continue to increase, especially after this debate performance?
I don't think, yeah, on the substance, I don't really think a whole lot changes because much of what Trump said tonight he has said before. And also remember, I mean, this is kind of an interesting situation because, Biden's been around in politics for the better part of 50 years. So, I mean, he's very much a known quantity. And Trump was already president, right? And so we can evaluate him on 4 years of his record and then everything he said in the last 3.5 years. And so these are two candidates that are very well known already to the American people. And so I guess what I'm saying is there's very little new that they could say
Mm.
that would be like shocking. I did mention the Israel comment earlier, which I think that was definitely different. But generally speaking, there hasn't been a whole lot of change in their positions, and I think the debate reflected that tonight.
Right. Could I ask you one final question before we let you go? American presidents tend to pride themselves on ending wars, on ensuring that they don't get involved in new conflicts. President Obama, of course, with Iraq and Afghanistan, that was something that he pledged to do. Of course, with President Biden, it seems like he's, of course, been roped into the war in Ukraine, also with this conflict in the Middle East. Do you think that the American people will look at that and say that, okay, this sort of counts against Biden in the sort of the foreign policy department? Do you think that President Trump managed to exploit that effectively? How do you see this?
Yeah, I mean, that certainly was Trump's intent, right? Is to say during my administration, there were no major wars, right? But during the Biden administration, there have been two wars and a messy withdrawal from Afghanistan, and not to mention that China is pushing the envelope with Taiwan and with the Philippines. I was just in the Philippines earlier this week, right? A lot of consternation there about what's been going on. So yeah, the world is a messier place under Biden, but we also have to think for a moment about causation. How did we get here, right? Is it all Biden's fault? Or is there some things that happened during the Trump administration that bled over into the Biden administration that the Biden administration had to deal with? And also, we got to ask the question, can or should America be in control of everything that happens in the world? Of course not, right?
Mm-hmm.
Other countries have agency. Other countries make decisions. They get a vote in international affairs. I don't just mean at the UN, but in terms of what they do vis-a-vis their neighbors and their rivals and their friends, right? And so I guess what I'm trying to say is the era of American primacy is over.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we are now in a multilateral, a multipolar system,
Mm-hmm.
and other countries like India, of course, get a chance to do things uninhibited by the United States. And so when we have presidential debates and the candidates point fingers at each other and try to blame each other for everything that went wrong, that's assuming that America could have actually done something, to stop the problem from starting, right? And I think that's probably not the case.
Understood. Derek Grossman, thank you so much for joining us. Viewers, you heard it here about just the foreign policy debates and the topics that were discussed in this first presidential debate. We'll keep you updated throughout the day. Derek Grossman, thank you again so much for joining us, and thank you for watching India Today Global.
Thank you.